Is caffeine really the problem that people make it out to be, or is it all in the dose and the timing? Inside today's episode, I'm going to break down a recent study from 2023 that details how caffeine can impact our sleep and what we can actually do about it. Welcome to sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. At this point, 80% of the world's population consumes caffeine through some medium, whether that's coffee or any other format. And it's also estimated that 30 to 45% of the world's population is lacking adequate sleep. It's pretty much a no-brainer that if you want good sleep, you should probably avoid caffeine consumption anywhere close to bedtime. And that's really where the idea of caffeine cutoffs came from. But when it comes to these caffeine cutoffs earlier in the day, the lines get a little bit blurry. What time should we really be cutting out caffeine consumption if we want to optimize our sleep? Now, a lot of factors go into this in terms of how fast we process caffeine, but we also have new research examining the effects of caffeine on sleep that can give us some hard and fast recommendations of when we might want to actually begin tapering that caffeine down, or if it might be time to try cutting out caffeine altogether for a bit. And you'll see that things like medications, body fat percentages, and other recreational substances can play into it. So we'll go ahead and dive in. We're going to start first with a little bit on the education and the process of how our bodies metabolize caffeine. Now, the half-life of caffeine varies drastically amongst different people. This can be anywhere from 2 to 12 hours solely based on genetics. And then when you start to stack lifestyle factors on top of that, it can extend or shorten the half-life as well. If you're not familiar, the half-life is basically the time it takes half of the drug to get out of your system or to clear your system. If we start to layer the lifestyle factors that extend caffeine's half-life, we can begin to get into some situations where caffeine is actually hanging around in the body way longer than it should be. For example, the most commonly used drug that would do this is actually oral contraceptives or hormonal birth control. In one study, oral contraceptive use extended caffeine's half-life to an average of 17 hours. And one subject even had a half-life of 25 hours, and that was after consuming that caffeine while being on an oral contraceptive. Other things that will make caffeine last longer in your system that we need to be mindful of is simply being overweight or obese. If you are overweight or obese, this extends the half-life of caffeine significantly, since caffeine is actually a fat-soluble substance. The next thing is grapefruit juice can impact the half-life, and also alcohol has been shown to extend caffeine's half-life by 72%, which is huge. That's a pretty wide margin. Now, also certain cardiovascular drugs like calcium channel blockers can make a difference here. So if you're taking those, it's going to impact caffeine's half-life. And then also pregnancy. In pregnancy, caffeine's half-life is extended due to progesterone levels. So you can see there's a number of different lifestyle elements that can extend how long caffeine is just hanging around in the body or how quickly it's going to be cleared based on your lifestyle, other drugs and medications, and your body fat. Now let's talk about this particular study that we'll be focusing on inside today's show. Now, this was basically what researchers refer to as a meta-analysis of 24 different studies. Their sole intent with publishing this was to give solid recommendations on when caffeine should be cut off for the best quality sleep. One of the first things they looked at was just any caffeine consumption versus no caffeine consumption on sleep. And what they found might surprise you. Compared to no caffeine consumption, people who drank any caffeine had on average 45 minutes of less total sleep time. They had 7% reduced sleep efficiency. It took them 9 minutes longer to fall asleep on average, and they had 1 to 3 more nighttime wake-ups than non-caffeine consumers. In terms of sleep stages, they spent a higher proportion in light sleep and a lower proportion in deep sleep. Now, don't be scared into thinking that you have to completely quit coffee or caffeine. I've definitely been known to enjoy these beverages myself. So this analysis of any caffeine also concluded that caffeine closer to bed, as well as caffeine earlier on in the day. Remember, this was a pretty black and white examination. So this then prompted the researchers to dig into the data and really visualize the exact dose of caffeine and the cutoff time where it wouldn't impact sleep. The results that the researchers found might actually surprise you here as well. I know I was a little surprised when I started to look at this particular breakdown. So what they did was they took their specific recommendations using caffeine amounts, and here's the exact quote from the paper. To avoid reductions in total sleep time and efficiency, 1 cup of coffee, basically 107 milligrams caffeine, should be consumed at least 8.8 hours prior to a bedtime, and a standard serving of pre-workout, which is 217 milligrams of caffeine. Now, obviously, this is an average. Some have 1, 2, or 300 milligrams, should be consumed 13.2 hours to bedtime. Now, I know there's people who are cutting that much closer to bedtime. So these are conservative numbers compared to what average health or fitness influencers generally talk about in their content. Most people in the health space will generally say things like a noon or 1 p.m. cutoff would be okay, and they don't really address the total amounts of caffeine here that are playing in. Whereas the researchers show total caffeine and dose clearly matters, and the more that you drink, the earlier your cutoff should be in order to achieve your best sleep. So let's zoom out for a little bit of perspective, because caffeine's certainly not all bad. It can have benefits on exercise performance and reducing delayed onset muscle soreness. It can be good for cognitive function. And so remember that I mentioned that how much variation there is in caffeine half-life based on both genetics and lifestyle factors. There truly are people who can consume caffeine within 3 to 4 hours of bedtime, and they say they sleep just fine. But realize these people are definitely a little more on the rare side. It's not super common, and most of us will need an earlier cutoff, as sad as that may make you as you listen to this show. Now, bringing this into the real world for yourself, or if you work with clients as a health coach, you can troubleshoot this a couple ways. If your client is struggling with sleep and the basic sleep and circadian hygiene practices aren't really cutting it, meaning they're getting morning light exposure, they're doing technology cutoffs in the evening, then we'd want to experiment with both a reduction and an earlier cutoff. So regardless of how they go about reducing their caffeine intake or bringing that cutoff in, I would say when they do introduce caffeine, do it with a small amount and institute it very early in terms of that cutoff to see if it impacts their sleep at night. Now, if it doesn't impact their sleep, you might have a little bit more leeway to play around with for further dose refinement and really nailing down the timing of someone's individual caffeine cutoff. If your client isn't willing to go, completely without caffeine, then basically you could just titrate that amount back and then make the cutoff a bit earlier, moving it further away from bedtime. As a reminder, before we close out today's show, I'm going to repeat the numbers that the researchers came to in case you missed it earlier in the episode. 1 cup of coffee, around 110 milligrams, 8.8 or 9 hours before bed. 1 serving of pre-workout was around 200 milligrams, 13 hours before bed. And I would use these as a guidepost, but take the liberty to play around with amounts and timing from there based on individuality and client biofeedback. For example, I've noticed a difference in terms of the type of caffeine, the actual compound, what it's derived from, whether that be green tea or coffee versus caffeine anhydrous. And there's certain caffeine combinations in supplements where there's multiple types of caffeine, maybe caffeine anhydrous, dimalate, and even other types of stimulants that are in those ingredients as well. So this doesn't mean that you can never have caffeine or that you shouldn't ever have stimulants. In fact, coffee actually can be a great addition in the right amounts and with the right timing as part of your daily ritual and routine. So this isn't about hating on those compounds necessarily. It's about including them in a way that's going to serve you and also allow you to get that optimal sleep so you have appropriate energy levels and can mitigate fatigue the restful and natural way through getting the best possible sleep and recovery, which most people struggle with. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, really anywhere from a third to nearly half of individuals can struggle with their sleep. And what we want to see is reduction in that sleep latency, improvements in sleep efficiency, ideally see slightly greater deep sleep, better quality and quantity of sleep over the course of the night. And obviously we can use different wearable devices for tracking that if that's available for you or your clients. I hope you learned something new today. I know for many individuals, whenever I used to share this information with clients or when I've posted it online, my social content, most people are surprised to learn about the effects of oral birth control or how alcohol can impact the half-life of caffeine, also pregnancy and how that can impact caffeine. Now, typically pregnant women are scaling back their caffeine intake, but having those higher hormone levels impacts the rate at which the body is clearing caffeine. If folks are overweight or obese, they may also see slight differences in terms of how they metabolize caffeine as they get leaner in their health and fitness journey. The important thing here is this can be individualized and customized, but most individuals need that slightly earlier caffeine cutoff in order to optimize their sleep, rest, and recovery for the next day energy levels and training performance. I appreciate you tuning in to today's episode. If you learned something new or appreciated this study breakdown, please share it with a friend, or you can post it on social media. I'm at sammillerscience. So if you give me a tag on any major platform, I always try to thank you guys personally for your shares of the show. If you're new here and you found a lot of value in the content, or if you've been a long time listener but haven't dropped a rating and review, this goes a long way into supporting the work that my team and I do here. There's not tons of ads. We don't have a ton of interruptions throughout the content. It's just the information and application that you need to make a difference in your own health or the people that you work with in their transformation. Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode, and I'll talk to you in the next show.